If you take a minute to look at everything that's around you, you might possibly be overwhelmed. There are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of different objects around you that you can pay attention to. If you focus on sound rather than vision, there are still probably hundreds of different noises that you could also pay attention to. For the most part, however, your subjective experience is probably that at any given moment, you only really notice a fraction of those objects or sounds. The question is, how does that happen? The answer is attention. Attention is the means by which we actively process a limited amount of information from the enormous amount of information available through our senses, our memories, and our other cognitive processes. The quote above comes from William James' book, The Principles of Psychology, published in 1890. In that quote, James makes two interesting points. First, when describing attention, he writes, "It is the taking possession by the mind," which seems to suggest that it's the mind that decides what we pay attention to. William James was quite prescient, as we'll see. One of the enduring debates when it comes to attention is whether or not we actually do have conscious control over what we pay attention to, or if other factors, such as the environment around us, decide what we pay attention to. Second, he writes, one out of what seems several simultaneously impossible objects or trains of thought. Is it really the case that we can only pay attention to one object or one train of thought? A second debate when it comes to attention is how well we can pay attention to two or more objects or two or more trains of thought at one time. Because William James was a functionalist, he might wonder why a mental process such as attention exists. Perhaps part of the answer is that humans are limited capacity processors, meaning that our minds do not have the capability to process hundreds and thousands of incoming sensory experiences, or thoughts, or memories. Thus, a mental process such as attention allows us to filter out that which is unnecessary and focus on what is necessary. Attention is also something of a gateway between perception and memory. We may perceive a lot, but what we end up paying attention to is ultimately what ends up being stored in memory. Attention, however, is not a perfect process. We've all seen a penny before, and I know that I have studied the head of a penny, even if only briefly. In other words, I have paid attention to a penny's appearance. But when asked which of the above is an accurate depiction of a penny, I, and most other people, would select an incorrect option. Nickerson's 1979 study found just that. Participants could not accurately reproduce or even recognize a penny, and they expressed disbelief when they were shown the accurate depiction of a penny. Researchers usually distinguish between two types of attention: selective attention and divided attention. Divided attention is the ability to attend to more than one task at a time. In this lecture, we will focus on selective attention. Suppose you are at a dinner party. You end up seated next to a salesman who decides to engage you in conversation by describing to you in detail the advantages of all the products he sells. As you are listening, you become aware of the conversation of the two diners sitting on your left, who are discussing much more interesting things, such as gossip about others at the dinner party. You find yourself trying to tune out the conversation with the salesman on your right so that you can hear the dialogue on your left. How successful would you be? This type of attention has been termed selective attention, which occurs when you try to ignore irrelevant incoming information, the salesman, and focus instead on more relevant or interesting information, the gossip. In 1953, Cherry referred to this phenomenon as the cocktail party problem, the process of tracking one conversation in the face of the distraction of other conversations. He observed that cocktail parties are often settings in which selective attention is salient. The primary question that Cherry attempted to answer is, how effective is selective attention? Can you successfully block all incoming information from entering your mind? If it is not possible to block all incoming information that you are trying to ignore, how much of it do you end up perceiving? To investigate this issue, Cherry devised a test called the dichotic listening task. In this task, subjects wear earphones and are presented with recordings of two different and usually unrelated messages from two speakers at the same time. One message is played over the left earphone and the other over the right earphone. Subjects are instructed to shadow one of the messages, to repeat out loud the message, and to ignore the second message, thereby requiring selective attention. The side that is attended to is called the attended channel, and the side that is ignored is called the unattended channel. Cherry tested different types of messages in the unattended channel to determine exactly what subjects were perceiving of it. For example, the message in the unattended channel may stop abruptly, resulting in silence, or the voice in the unattended channel may switch from a male to a female speaker. After subjects completed shadowing the message in the attended channel, he would ask subjects about what they noticed from the unattended channel. Here we have a demonstration of the dichotic listening task. One ear has the ignored or unattended message playing. The other ear has the attended message playing, and the subject is shadowing or repeating what is played in the attended ear. Above is a list of different changes that were made to the unattended channel, and whether or not the change was noticed by subjects. Thus, subjects did notice if the message in the unattended channel transitioned to silence, if it changed from a man's voice to a woman's voice, and if the voice transitions to a steady tone. These are primarily physical characteristics of the message, such as pitch. Thus, these findings suggested that at a minimum, when individuals try to selectively attend to one message and selectively ignore another, the physical characteristics of the ignored message will still be processed. You can also imagine this in a more visual scenario. If you get on an elevator with another person and you try to ignore him or her, you will still probably perceive something about that person, perhaps their age, height, gender, or other physical characteristics. However, Cherry also found that many aspects of the unattended channel were not noticed. The content of the message, the language of the message, if the message transitioned from English to French, and also whether the message was complete nonsense, backwards speech. Thus, even though physical characteristics of the unattended message are perceived, the actual meaning of the message appears not to be. Several different theories were proposed to account for selective attention. The first was early filter/early selection theory by Broadbent in 1958. The second was attenuation/later selection theory by Anne Treisman in 1964. The third was late selection models by Deutsch and Deutsch in 1963. And the fourth was multimode models by Johnston and Heinz in 1978. According to early selection theory, we filter information right after we notice it at the sensory level. Sensory information enters a sensory register or buffer, and in that sensory register, incoming information is analyzed for physical characteristics, things like whether the pitch of the sound is high or low. After this basic analysis of physical characteristics, a selective filter allows some of the information to be further processed. Information that is blocked by the filter will remain briefly in the sensory register, but then will decay. Thus, in the dichotic listening task, both the attended and unattended messages were analyzed for physical characteristics. And then the filter allowed the attended message to proceed to be processed for things like the meaning of the message, whereas the unattended message isn't processed to that depth. Not long after Broadbent's theory, evidence from other studies using the dichotic listening task suggested that Broadbent's model wasn't fully correct. For example, in one study, an ambiguous message was presented in the attended channel. The man approached the bank, and in the unattended channel, a word was presented, such as money or river, that could influence how the attended message was interpreted. Specifically, how the word bank was interpreted, as a financial institution or the bank of a river. When subjects were asked to paraphrase the attended message, their interpretation reflected the word that was presented in the unattended channel, suggesting that the word had been processed for meaning, even if they could not report that money or river had been presented in the unattended channel. Similarly, other studies demonstrated that if the message presented in the unattended channel continued the message presented in the attended channel, then subjects would switch to shadowing the unattended channel. For example, if the attended channel the message presented was "Happy Birthday," and in the unattended channel "To You" was presented directly afterwards, then subjects would shadow "Happy Birthday to You," which again suggests that the meaning of the unattended channel had been processed. Lastly, there is the cocktail party effect, in which you hear your name being called even if you are attending to something else, or trying to block out all other noise. This again suggests that you perceive the meaning of things you are not attending to. Therefore, the filter theory can't be right to suggest that unattended information is completely blocked at the sensory analysis level. To explain these findings, Treisman proposed the attenuation theory of attention. Attenuation theory is just a slight modification of Broadbent's early selection/filter model. According to attenuation theory, there is an attenuator, attenuation control in the diagram above, that analyzes incoming messages not only for physical characteristics, but also for the language and meaning of the message. If the attenuator decides that the message is important, then it may proceed for further processing, such as entering into short-term memory. More important words or words heard frequently, such as one's name, have a lower threshold and can be easily detected, whereas less important words have a higher threshold. Treisman proposed that not only does the attended message pass through the attenuator, but important parts of the unattended message may pass through as well. Thus, the only major difference between Broadbent's filter theory and Treisman's attenuation theory is the degree to which unattended or ignored information is processed. Because attenuation control is an unconscious process, this theory makes the interesting claim at the time that we can unconsciously process meaning. Other selective attention models have been proposed as well. A late selection or response selection model proposed by Deutsch and Deutsch in 1963 suggests that all information in the unattended ear is processed on the basis of meaning, not just the selected or highly pertinent information. However, only the information that is relevant for the task response gets into conscious awareness. This model is consistent with ideas of subliminal perception. In other words, that you don't have to be aware of or attending a message for it to be fully processed for meaning. You might notice that this figure looks a lot like that of the early selection model. Only the location of the selective filter has changed, with the assumption that the analysis of meaning occurs before selection occurs, but only the selected information becomes conscious. Why did researchers keep coming up with different models? Because no model really seemed to account for all the data, some of which indicates that non-selected information is blocked completely, whereas other studies suggest it can be processed for meaning. The multi-mode model addresses this apparent inconsistency, suggesting that the stage at which selection occurs can change depending on the task. Johnston and Heinz in 1978 demonstrated that under some conditions, we can select what we attend to at a very early stage, and we do not process the content of the unattended message very much at all. Analyzing physical information, such as attending to information based on whether it is a female or male voice, is relatively easy. It occurs automatically, rapidly, and doesn't take much effort. Under the right conditions, we can select what we attend to on the basis of the meaning of the messages. However, the late selection option, processing the content of all messages before selection, is more difficult and requires more effort. The benefit, though, is that we have the flexibility to change how we deploy our attention depending on what we are trying to accomplish, which is one of the greatest strengths of our cognitive system.